welcome back to the Breakfast Show. It is, take a quick sneak peek, 5 minutes past to 9 a.m. here on a Thursday morning. Now, we're going to start off with our first guest of the show, and they're going to be here to talk about website accessibility. Now, if you're wondering what a website accessibility is, it's how user-friendly it is, but not just for anybody, not just for people like Hans and I, for everybody from all scopes or all parts of the community, especially the elderly and the disabled, who are actually big users of the internet, especially here in Malaysia.
And according to this one stat, only 3% of the top 30 companies in Malaysia offer web accessibility to users with special needs. Now, we'll find out what the reason why and how we can improve on this. We have with us the Group Managing Director of Spire Research and Consulting, Mr. Leon Pereira. Good morning.
Good morning to you. Thank you for having me on the show.
Oh,
it's our
welcome.
pleasure.
Our pleasure, yeah.
Okay, we can probably start off with, you know, website accessibility. You know, still probably a lot of people do not know exactly what it means. So what does it mean, especially with regards to the elderly and the disabled?
Well, web accessibility is all about disabled users actually being able to use the internet. So an accessible website is disabled user friendly, and the disabled user community is a big segment. It's often neglected by companies, but it is substantial, and I think the many people there rely on the web, sometimes to a greater extent than people without disabilities. The web is a good medium for people with disabilities. Some of them can't get around so easily or have conversations with other people because they may be blind, they may be deaf, they may have issues in terms of movement around, they may be in a wheelchair. So the internet is a good medium, and many of them use the internet regularly. So I think an accessible website would be a website that enables them to do all the same things that a person without disabilities can do.
Now, how does an accessible website differ from a non-accessible? I mean, what type of features or how does it look actually different from the others?
Well, there are a number of differences. So, for example, for blind users, an accessible website should be laid out in a logical manner so that the software that blind users use to read out the material on the web can actually help them to navigate from one part of the site to another part because the structure is very logical and it flows. Also for deaf users, podcasts and video clips should have text versions. For users who have some motor skill impediment, so they can't control a mouse as well, there should be keyboard shortcuts so that they don't need to use a mouse to get to navigate the website. So it's functionalities like this.
Right. Now, you pointed out, of course, as I mentioned early on, 3% of the top 30 companies in Malaysia offer web accessibility to people with special needs. Why is it important for the top 30 companies in Malaysia to have web accessibility for special needs?
Well, this was an interesting finding from a survey. Only 3% of even the largest companies are providing that, so we were a little bit surprised. I think that it is important for two reasons. One is that companies can tap on a larger consumer base. I think people with disabilities are a customer segment. They can potentially buy products on the internet just like people without disabilities. Sometimes they would do that even more, I think, people without disabilities. So there is revenue there. There is a business case.
There's business there.
Exactly. The other reason, I think, is it helps to boost the brand image of a company. I think nowadays consumers will reward companies that have a more progressive, socially conscious agenda. And those kinds of brands would be preferred. So there are gains for companies to go into this.
I see. Now, of course, you know, this survey was done according to the W3C guidelines, which is the World Wide Web Consortium recommendations. Tell us a little bit about that guideline. You know, how are these guidelines determined, and what exactly are they?
Well, the W3C, firstly, is the Worldwide Consortium for the Web. It's a US-based organization that draws on leading experts around the world to formulate best practice standards. And one of the leaders there is one of the founders of the Internet who actually coined the term the World Wide Web. So it has some clout within the Internet community. A lot of research, experimentation, and expert views actually went into formulating these standards coming out of the US. And they are used by governments. For example, in Korea and Australia, government websites are mandated to follow these standards. So they are formulated as the best practice globally. There is no better standard to follow.
And how does our government websites fare? Our government-linked websites fare? Do they fall into the standards of the W3C?
Well,
guidelines?
not to the same extent as you would see, say, in Australia, or perhaps to a lesser extent in Korea. In Australia, there is legislation that was passed in 1992 that really encourages and to some extent mandates websites to be accessible. And in Korea, there's similar legislation. In the US, there is as well. So I think in Malaysia, probably there is some lagging behind that kind of standard.
So, here's the reason why only out of 30 companies that were included in the survey, only one company fared quite well, is because of the lacking of this legislation.
I would say that's a key reason, because the government can be a catalyst for the private sector. If government websites have the standard, then private websites are probably likely to follow, especially the larger companies.
Yeah, okay. Okay, now this research was not just done in Malaysia, it was done across 5 countries. Which 5 are they?
Australia, Malaysia, Singapore, South Korea, and Hong Kong.
Okay, and which one fared the best?
Well, Australia actually fared the best. So of the 30 largest companies, which you would imagine would be the most socially progressive companies, 1/3 of them actually had websites that were accessible to disabled users. And for Malaysia and Singapore, they were fared about the same level at 3% of the top 30.
Okay, do you think that corporations actually, like you mentioned just then, it's actually good for a company to want to take this on? Consumers also will see it as a caring company. Goodwill will increase. But do corporations actually see the importance yet? What can they do?
Well, that's a very good point. I think corporations are still really lagging behind the curve here. They still don't get it. I think it's not really moved up the priority list. There isn't so much awareness maybe among the management teams of companies. But the interesting thing is that it's not that difficult to do. A project to make your entire website accessible may not be extremely costly. It may just take 3 to 6 months to effect. And there are some easy gains. You increase your customer base and so on. So it's something that could be relatively easily corrected for a large company. So that is surprising. I think the private sector should step up to the plate more here.
They should definitely.
And for the government side, is there any plans for legislating like a law to be passed that companies or government-linked agencies' websites have to have these follow these W3C guidelines?
Well, I think for most governments within this region, I think Malaysia is one of them, there isn't a rush to pass binding legislation or mandates to make private websites or government websites accessible. I think most of the governments in the region, Malaysia included, are more cautious in this regard so as to avoid increasing the cost of doing business, compliance costs. But I think the point here is that it's not really that costly. And at least the larger companies should be encouraged or incentivized in some way to do this.
Okay, that's one great way.
But like you mentioned before, I mean, if the government starts doing it with their linked agencies, then it becomes a catalyst and sort of gets the ball rolling for the private sector as well.
Absolutely, and I think disability activists in Malaysia, such as Mary Chan or Anthony Tanasayan, for example, have been calling for this. There was a meeting on website accessibility in 2008, convened by the National Council for the Blind Malaysia. So I think there are many voices that are calling for this move to be accelerated.
And it's quite tough because, I mean, these days, the amount of time we spend on the internet, and for the blind, it's pretty much like going out there with a no walking stick and no hearing aid, so it can be, you can just imagine how difficult it is.
I know.
I mean, we take it for granted that we can just hold a mouse and just look at the screen and just see whatever pops up.
I know what technology is supposed to do is actually supposed to make the world smaller and information a lot more accessible to people all over, but because of technology and the way it is, it's sort of, it's a sort of a limitation. It gives limitations to those with disabilities. And hopefully, thanks to the survey by your company, that the proper steps will be taken to ensure that web accessibility is achieved.
Last question to Leon here is that what are you going to do with this information that you have right now? Based on research, what are you going to do with it?
I think Spire Research and Consulting is working with various companies to try and draw some publicity around this information so that we can increase awareness among governments, but also among large companies to make them aware that this is something easy to do, and it's something to build a more inclusive society and build a better brand for them. In the past, I think disabled people were marginalized because there were no ramps and so on. So now this is the last frontier to build that inclusiveness.
The World Wide Web, the last frontier. All right, thank you very much, Leon, for enlightening us on this issue. All the best, and hopefully, we can help the disabled and people with special needs to gain that access to the World Wide Web.
Right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Okay, with that, we're going to take another quick break here.